across, and again, you'll be able to sort of extrapolate and at least draw from an initial exposure in this class. And so, just look at the front part of the lower limb here, and take some hallmark nerves that we've seen before, and just have a general idea of where these nerves kind of innervate into the skin. And that's really what this particular slide is about. And remember, cutaneous nerves themselves come from spinal nerves that we've been used to seeing all along. These are some of the spinal nerves shown here are in the lumbar region, from the lumbar plexus. And so what we're looking at in these particular areas, and what I'd kind of like you to, I guess, focus on, I've indicated here. More than the others, I would say, keep in mind, because this general pattern of innervation also kind of feeds a little bit back into the muscles that we're going to take a look at. So if you kind of have an appreciation for this femoral nerve being in the front, we'll see that when we look at the quadricep muscles, that this femoral nerve also feeds into them. There's an obturator nerve, which is a little bit more seen in the adductor muscles, which makes sense when you understand its location in the skin. The ilioinguinal nerve is not so much seen so much in what we're going to look at, so don't worry about stressing that too much. And don't worry so much about this genitofemoral nerve, but we have seen these nerves before, which is why I bring them up when we're looking at the pelvic area and things like that. The saphenous nerve down here in the bottom, we just went over it when we were looking at this saphenous cut down, and it's a branch off the femoral nerve here that courses through and innervates the regions of the thigh. So I think that a couple of things that we visited before, these dermatome maps, one thing that we haven't really mentioned is that sometimes in dermatome maps you have a concept called axial lines. And so what we're looking at here is just some dermatome maps of the lower limb, and I won't ask you to memorize any of these in a very specific sense. One thing I do want you to appreciate, however, let's take a look at this dermatome map here, for example, is that kind of on the anterior aspect, you're really looking at a lot of lumbar innervation, lumbar nerve innervation, and the posterior aspect has a little bit more sacral. So just in a big picture sense, appreciate that type of innervation in the skin of the lower limb. And remember, a dermatome is basically the skin supplied by a single spinal nerve. So that's a concept that we went over long ago. And there's this axial line here that these dermatomes basically, as a general rule, tend to blend in their divisions. It's not a very precise division because the axons and the dendrites themselves kind of have networking aspects to them, and so there's not a very clear line, there's a fuzzier line, and so there's overlap in a particular area that leads back to sensory information. That overlap really does not occur as much when you're looking at an axial line, which is basically a division on the skin that corresponds to a different plexus, like something like the sacral plexus versus a lumbar plexus. There, the sort of nerves might not integrate as readily, and so on these axial lines, we have a much finer division of innervation. And here they're just showing you different types of dermatome maps. One corresponds to clinical type of settings, and the other one corresponds a little bit more to the course that the nerves take during developmental biology and during developmental stages. Don't worry so much about differentiating between the two, but just be aware that the clinical sort of elements are slightly different than these strict developmental studies that were done before. Again, this difference is probably due to this cross-association that occurs. And so you might have a study that really kind of finely defines where nerves should be, but really in actual practice, they network a lot more than you actually think. And so that hence you have this sort of difference in the dermatome maps. So let's get into this thigh and gluteal region and kind of jump into the muscles. This particular snippet that I wrote out here from your text is going to be a little bit more relevant when we look at the gluteal region, and I'll bring it up again. But since we're looking at the thigh and the gluteal region in general, it's important to bring up that there's basically, 4 general compartments, one being in the lower limb thigh area. You have this sort of gluteal region, and then muscles that are accompanying this gluteal region are these other muscles organized into 3 compartments. So you have the gluteal region and 3 other compartments for a total of like 4 general areas below the hip. You're looking at an anterior, medial, and posterior area, which we already looked at before in its sort of sectioned off transverse sections in previous lectures. These guys are extensors, the anterior ones, extensors of the thigh. The medial ones are adductors of the thigh, and the posterior ones are flexors of the thigh. And so have clear in your head what extension of the thigh means and what extension of the leg means and what flexion of the leg means versus flexion of the thigh. So remember, the leg is that part that includes the tibia and the fibula, and the thigh is above the kneecap. And so you're kind of talking about flexion and extension, and we'll look at that very shortly and have an appreciation for what that means, as what it means to be extending at the hip versus extending at the knee. They are two different areas of the thigh. So one is sort of like, raising up your thigh, and the other one is just sort of kicking out your leg. And so we'll kind of go over that, but review that as well. And so let's look at the anterior thigh muscles, which contains the flexors of the hip and the extensors of the knee. And so you'll get an appreciation for what flexion of the hip means if you're not sure of it, and extension of the knee is when we look at the actual muscles themselves. So these are flexors of the hip. And so we're going to look at the origins and insertions. And one sort of medical perspective before we get lost into the particulars of the muscles. When we're looking at these thigh flexors, there's something called a groin pull that you guys might have heard, and the girls too. When you're watching sports, if you pull your groin, you're kind of talking about straining these muscles. Remember, strain has a very specific term in our class, right? It's sort of like a tearing of the muscle. I said the TR kind of indicates that. So we're kind of tearing some flexor and adductor thigh muscles. Mainly these guys have an attachment in the inguinal region, and so keep that in mind as we look at some of these muscles. And we're going to look right now at the flexor muscles, and the adductor thigh muscles will come in later when we look at the medial compartment of the thigh. We're looking at the anterior compartment right now. Remember that inguinal area is sort of lateral to the pubic area, and so we're looking at this sort of area right here, and so your groin pull is going to come from some of these muscles. Let's just we're going to go through pretty much all of the muscles. So we're going to nonetheless really simplify things, and what I want you to know about these muscles is what I've written right here in red text, or underlined, as we'll see in a red line. And so you don't have to memorize all the particulars. Let's say, does it go to the greater trochanter of the femur as opposed to the femur in general, unless I indicate that. And I'll indicate that because it sort of helps you understand functionality. Sometimes it might help you understand functionality and I don't indicate it, but really what I want you to know is, in a very fine-tuned way, you'll get the big picture. But what I want you to know is really what I put here in red. So this pectineus muscle, and we'll kind of go from top to bottom. Looking at the pectineus muscle, the proximal attachment is here in the pubis, so you guys need to kind of be aware that these guys attach in a hip bone that we've been looking at before. The distal attachment is in the femur. I don't think we're indicating it to you in this picture here. The nerve that goes to it is the femoral nerve. And I'd like you to know in general, big picture general, don't worry about the numbers per se, based upon